This week on Pocket Pedagogy, a woo-hoo! As we bring Duck Month to a close, some final shoutouts are in order. Of course, we need to shout out Disney's most other famous duck-turned-video game star, Donald's Uncle Scrooge. Making his debut in the 1947 story Christmas on Bear Mountain, Scrooge McDuck is through and through a Carl Barks creation, with all of the narrative and symbolic conceits of the creator intact. The Scottish-born billionaire Duck started off as, well, a total jerk. A greedy loner who pushed indigenous people off their lands, and who once faked his own death to avoid spending time with his family. Scrooge ultimately served as an ideological foil and antagonist to the occasionally hard scrabble and perpetually hard luck Donald Duck. Over time, however, Scrooge became more popular, so Barks tweaked the character from an antagonist into an anti-hero, and ultimately to a swashbuckling adventurer and explorer who headlined his own comic series. Scrooge's adventures became some of the most popular comics of their day, drawing fans from all over the world. Fans like one George Lucas, who based the famous Boulder chase scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark on a similar scene from the story of the Seven Cities of Cibola from issue number 7 of Scrooge's solo series. So really, Scrooge McDuck is pulp adventure royalty. And you can really give a lot of credit for that to our other shout out that we gotta make. Don Rosa grew up a massive fan of Barks' Scrooge comics, and has said in the past that Barks is his favorite cartoonist and Scrooge his favorite comics character of all time. In 1986, he wrote his first Scrooge McDuck story for Gladstone Comics, The Son of the Sun, which was nominated for a Harvey Award, and in 1991 he started what would become his best-known work, The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. This 12-issue maxi series reconciled all of Barks' Scrooge stories into one consistent biography of the character's life, spanning 7 decades. Rosa fleshed out the character's backstory, his family tree, and his motivations in this sprawling Eisner Award-winning tale, and his work is arguably right alongside his idols in terms of importance to the character's enduring popularity. While it's by no means part of Disney's official continuity, Rosa's work inspired countless stories in other media as well. Which brings us to the topic of today's episode. Debuting in 1987, DuckTales was an effort by Disney to make higher quality television animation for afternoon syndication. The show was steeped in Barks' original comics work, even adapting some of his stories, and its success inspired not only multiple seasons, but eventually the entire Disney afternoon block of syndicated shows like Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Talespin, and my personal favorite, Darkwing Duck. Now, let's be clear, and before anybody leaves angry comments, neither Barks nor Rosa were ever directly involved with the show. Rosa in particular has been clear that while he liked the original 1987 cartoon, it was never a truly accurate adaptation of Barks' work in his mind, and he is very adamant that his comics are wholly separate from the show. His attitude toward the excellent 2017 reboot seems pretty similar, though it is clearly heavily inspired by the work of both creators. For dorks of a certain vintage, however, the most indelible part of the DuckTales phenomenon is the 1989 NES game. This was Capcom's first fully developed and published Disney game, and it was a doozy, with platforming gameplay that rewarded exploration with secrets and higher scores, impeccable controls, and arguably one of the greatest soundtracks on the platform, if not all of video game history. Most notable of the tracks is the Moon theme, which the mere playing of will ultimately bring a tear to the eye of any of those aforementioned dorks, many of whom ended up making the 2017 reboot and making that song feature prominently in ways that are really too good to spoil. So let's just take a break and listen for a moment, shall we? Okay, we gotta move on. I'm just gonna sit here vibing all day. Look, DuckTales got ported to the Game Boy in 1990, and a full-blown sequel, DuckTales 2, showed up in 1993, 3 years after the series stopped airing new episodes, and a scant 2 years before the NES went out of production. The sequel lacked the memorable music of its predecessor, but added more complexity to the gameplay and encouraged backtracking and exploration to an even greater degree. Unfortunately, it came out at a time when many players had already moved on to the next hardware generation, and because of its lower print run, not many copies were actually sold. As such, it's one of the rare NES games on the secondary market, and even loose cartridge-only copies regularly sell for $200 to $300 on eBay. Complete copies and sealed copies can get up into the thousands. The Game Boy port of DuckTales 2 is much easier and cheaper to acquire in its original form, since it was produced in much larger numbers on a platform that was still very viable in 1993. But this Game Boy port of DuckTales 2 is an interesting game in and of itself, acting as a sort of reimagining of the source material and showing what even the aging Game Boy was capable of. This makes it a perfect candidate for our final installment of
Quack.
DuckTales 2 was released in November 1993 for the Game Boy as a not quite direct port of that NES game. Now, the premise for both versions of the game is the same. Huey finds a torn piece of paper that turns out to be part of an ancestral Clan McDuck treasure map, and so Scrooge and company set out to find the rest of that map as well as whatever other treasure they can find. Both versions of DuckTales 2 notably build on their predecessors. Players can once again tackle the game's levels, which range from Niagara Falls to Egypt, in any order they wish. Like its predecessor, DuckTales 2 is built around collecting as much treasure as possible to increase your score, so you're going to spend a lot of time seeking out that treasure in each level, as well as the pieces of the map leading to the McDuck clan's secret bounty, and the special artifacts protected by each level's boss. If you find all 6 of the map pieces, you unlock a special hidden area and the game's true ending. Like the original game, DuckTales 2's combat and traversal are tied to Scrooge's cane/pogo stick, which allows him to bounce around stages and off of enemy heads. This time, however, the bounce is simplified, no more pushing down and B, and the cane's utility is actually expanded, as it is used to solve certain puzzles and interact with the environment. Scrooge can now hook pillars with the cane and drag them into position, pull back on springs and go flying across gaps, use his golf swing attack on a wall to push rafts and other platforms forward, and even use the cane to fire cannons at enemies. DuckTales 2 adds some variety in the form of adapters that make the cane even more powerful, allowing you to smash through certain blocks and move heavier objects. These enhancements aren't necessary to find some of the game's hidden treasures and may need to be acquired on subsequent returns to completed stages. Finding the hidden loot in certain levels is much easier when you go in the recommended order. So far, these elements are present in both versions of the game, but it's here that we start to see what makes the Game Boy game unique. Even though it's nearly feature complete compared to the NES version, DuckTales 2 is not a direct port. It's better thought of as a remix of the original game, with several changes that make it worth considering on its own merits. Now, it's not clear why some of these changes, like where items are found and how much of Scrooge's money they cost, were made. And while you'd think the game would largely be streamlined and simplified for the handheld, that's really not the case. Take, for instance, the game's safe item. While your cash total resets every time you lose a life, the safe lets you bank all the money you make in a run and add it to your total if you have one. On the NES, the safe works automatically, but on the Game Boy, you must choose to use it manually each time. Presumably, this is a quality of life change, so you can use the safe only when you have an amount you really want to keep, so it's not really a bad change. The Game Boy version did increase the amount of damage some foes can take before they are defeated, though, and you can lose some item effects like the X-ray glasses that let you see through walls and the signposts that point to treasure when you die. So technically, it is a more difficult version. More interesting changes, however, come with the game's levels, which vary significantly from the NES original. Going through the same stage will yield noticeably different experiences on each platform, though some aspects do overlap. It's not quite clear why they changed the level designs, but it's likely because these designs are easier to read on the Game Boy's smaller screen. It's also probably why Scrooge's sprite seems bigger relative to his environment. It's all still very impressive though, as is the fact that this game managed to maintain most of its frames of animation from the original, as well as a pretty accurate interpretation of the game's soundtrack. The original DuckTales Game Boy game hadn't quite figured out how to use that system's sound channels, leading to a situation where that beautiful piece of moon music would cut in and out to accommodate sound effects. But for DuckTales 2, they figured it out, and the sonic experience is pretty darn close to the original. Now, the game's not perfect. The NES game runs faster in general, which is to be expected, and there is some significantly noticeable slowdown throughout the Game Boy game, which can again lead to problems in tricky platforming segments. While these slowdown bouts do come and go, when it hits, it can completely throw off the game's flow to the point of being mildly frustrating. Still, considering the ambition of this port, that slowdown isn't too shocking, and overall, it doesn't feel like a compromise at all. It's not that the Game Boy version of DuckTales 2 is really better or worse than its NES counterpart, it's rather that it's two different voices riffing on the same material, something that would be pretty familiar to Scrooge McDuck fans. So, what can we learn from this game? I want to talk briefly about the idea of transmedia here. It's something I've written quite a bit about. Transmedia is the idea that characters and stories in media are no longer confined to just one medium, and instead can be explored and told over many. The classic example, of course, is the Star Wars saga. It is not told just via its films, but also novels, comic books, video games, and now streaming television shows. Each part contributes to a greater whole, and encourages the audience to seek out that story in multiple forms. Transmedia characters, on the other hand, may not have a single story that's told across multiple forms, but are characters who are interpreted again and again through different media at different times for different audiences. Batman, for example, exists in comic books, video games, movies, and more, and regardless of which version you prefer, each one contributes its own idea to the larger sort of cultural notion of Batman in the public consciousness, and each version borrows elements that it likes from other interpretations. So Scrooge McDuck is absolutely a transmedia character. He began in the comics of Carl Barks and was expanded upon by Don Rosa. He reached new audiences via two extremely popular television cartoon series and is the focal point of two classic video games. Those Barks comics influenced the original television show, as well as Don Rosa's comics. That television show influenced the DuckTales video games, and the original show, Rosa and Barks' comics, and the video games influenced the 2017 reboot, which is riddled with nostalgic callbacks to all of them, but the games in particular. In this light, the DuckTales video game franchise is a vital part of the transmedia construction of Scrooge McDuck, and a key way that a specific generation of fans can interact with the character and the Disney brand. So, DuckTales 2 on the Game Boy carries with it the weight of tremendous expectations, but it carries that weight with aplomb. This is probably the best of the Duck games we played this month, and there's a reason I close with it. Frankly, the DuckTales video games matter. Not only are they terrific adaptations of a beloved character and television show, they are also just excellent games, with an unmatched alchemical mixture of accessibility, exploration, personality, and action. They may actually be perfect video games, and they're worth seeking out for anyone looking for inspiration or a crash course in game design. Until next time, I'm Brian Carr, and thanks for watching Pocket Pedagogy. Next time on Pocket Pedagogy, we sail the 7 seas and play the 9 innings.